My name is Matthew Touch, and this is actually English 2220, Race, Comics, and Monsters. I may have gotten that actually mixed up a little bit. And we're doing Killadelphia volumes 1 and 2 for this course. And I'm excited because this is actually volume 3, sorry. I'm excited to have Rodney Barnes, the author of Killadelphia, and of course, the art is done by Jason Shawn Alexander, joining me today to actually talk about volumes 1 and 2. So thank you for being with me.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I didn't get into Killadelphia until later, just because of the fact that I really started pulling comics later, a couple of years ago. And John Jennings, I think, was the one who actually introduced me to it. And he said you kept needing to read it. So I finally picked up, I think.
Good old John.
I know.
Yes.
Hopefully he'll be in talking with my class for something too. But he kept telling me about it, and I finally picked it up, I think, last Christmas, volumes 1 and 2. And I was like, okay, I got to teach this. So we're doing it actually this semester. And there's a lot to talk about. And this course that we're doing is actually dealing with the Gothic and horror. And of course, Killadelphia fits right in with that kind of theme. So let's just get started. I have a few questions, and who knows where to go from there. But one of the things we're actually talking about with the Gothic is Robert Martin says that the Gothic is most often a politically conservative form that gives expression to the anxieties of a class threatened with violent dissolution. On the other hand, the Gothic can allow for the voice of the culturally repressed and hence act out a resistance to the dominant culture. And of course, that's what Killadelphia does, I would say. And they're actually reading in this class. They're not reading too much Gothic, but they are going to read a couple of tales from Edgar Allan Poe, look at a few other things. For me, Killadelphia embodies each of these poles. On the one hand, we see the politically conservative with the mayor at the beginning who gets, turned or killed, and other powerful individuals like the Adamses. Conversely, those that attempt to take over society and shape it in their image are the politically conservative, preying on the repressed. While reading Killadelphia, I also thought about John Jennings and Stanford Carpenter's ethnogothic, that term, which, as Jennings puts it, the ethnogothic deals with primarily speculative narratives that actively engage with negatively affective and racially oriented psychological traumas via the traditions of Gothic tropes and technologies. So that's a lot of information there, I know, but can you kind of speak a little bit about Killadelphia in relation to kind of the Gothic tradition with that politically conservative aspect?
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that made me want to create Killadelphia was in school, I never felt like I was getting an accurate portrayal of American history. I knew I was getting a piece of American history. And I started to do a lot of independent study just because I was a curious kid and I like to read. And when you start getting into that idea of class and how that affects how people see themselves, how life sort of works in America on a class scale distinction, I wanted to sort of use genre to connect the past and the present. And I couldn't think of any other monster of sorts, for lack of a better word, than vampires that could sort of accomplish that. And when I started to work on the idea of what America looked like in the 1700s and the thinking of that period of time, and sort of being able to ignore the idea of slavery being what it was, and sort of, within the founding fathers, with the exception of Adams a little bit. I mean, I know Thomas Jefferson talked about it, but he still owned slaves, and he had his relationship with Sally Hemings and all of that. But it was just this mass distortion of you're creating this thing about equality and this free country, but yet you enslave human beings. And so, I wanted to juxtapose that to today's world, where I think folks are sort of controlled in a lot of different ways. It's not slavery in the classic sense of the word, but we certainly are sort of programmed to be in certain boxes. Economics plays a huge part of that and how people see themselves. And connecting those two, that Gothic idea of the conservative in horror, was one thing, but like you say, I sort of played to the other idea of, but I think I sort of integrate both. It's sort of hard to describe because I try to integrate both ideas from a conservative and a liberal idea of what the horror experience has been in regards to the Gothic idea and connect the two. And I try to leave myself out of the argument or out of the equation and just sort of tell the story. I let the characters give their opinions more so than me in judging it, if that makes sense.
That makes sense, because that's what's really fascinating to me is I reread volume 3 today, even though we're not doing that for class. But as you continue to reread it and knowing, of course, I usually teach the letter that Abigail Adams wrote to John Adams, about remember the women when you're writing the Constitution. And he's basically like, if I have to remember them, then I have to remember Indigenous, I have to remember, I have to remember free people. I have to remember all these other constituencies are coming up.
Right.
And while Abigail was definitely one of the, I would say, villains to me, she's also somebody who you see her position, because it's that intersectionality partly. She's not dealing with race, I think, with her, but definitely the patriarchy with her and her being put behind, right?
Well, it's also the chickens coming home to roost of all of these problems that haven't really been dealt with. Even when you abolish a thing, if you don't heal the thing that was the problem at the time, it still festers and manifests, I think, in today's society. But
no, and that's definitely what you see. I was rereading that part, of course, with Jupiter yesterday, looking back over for something I was doing. And when he's actually, after he kills the rapper, I think Blake Scott, right? He's with Abigail, but he goes to jail. That direct link, of course, with mass incarceration and enslavement. And volume 3 teases that out even more. I realize there's a lot with volume 3, which I wish I added that with the class. I may have some of the students read that. But there's a lot of that kind of teasing with it. But Jupiter, to me, is a really, I wouldn't say fascinating, but I think important character. Because one thing that I kind of noticed is you see his story, but you see it from Abigail and Jefferson first. And then you get him. So how would you kind of talk about Jupiter? Because to me, he's kind of the embodiment of this through line.
You actually just used the word I was going to use. He's the embodiment of anger and rage of that period of time, but also confusion. I think you can't pile so much trauma on a culture or an individual and not have it affect their ability to see the world objectively. And I think Jupiter is the embodiment of that. I learned about Jupiter when I was in junior high school, and how he actually used his money as a slave. He was friends. They grew up together, Thomas and Jupiter. He was his slave. He was Thomas Jefferson's boy slave friend. And when Thomas was broke in college, he gave him his money and to help him stay in school and get his books and all of these other things. And Thomas still treated him like a slave, no matter how good Jupiter was to him or how much friendship, he showed him. And so I always thought, like, what did that do to Jupiter's mind? And, if slavery, if the enslaved had a voice, in today's world, and they do, in a different kind of way, but if it was pure and it was rage and it was the thing that I think actually that idea is sort of, some say, is part of what's going on in our society today with the fear of the browning of America, that somehow the brown people will do to the dominant society what was done to them. That's sort of what Jupiter embodies, that anger, that rage. You can't really reason with rage. You really can't, it's like the Terminator. You can't really logically sit down and talk to it because it's been festering for generations. And so that's sort of what Jupiter is.
Yeah, and I think to me what's fascinating about him, or what's I think important about him too, is the fact that it's the rage, but he also understands it, and it's his kind of struggle with his humanity and his identity too.
I think he's trying to. I think because it wavers. It's like you said in volume 3, something happens when there's a reunion, but something you wouldn't expect. But that all comes from that idea of a lack of clarity. When you see sometimes behavior in certain communities that works against the individual, a lot of times that's just trauma manifesting itself, I believe. I don't know for sure, but from the things that I've studied. And if you look at history and you look at how sometimes people react, a lot of times it's because they've been treated so poorly over time that the way they see themselves. I'm more interested, a lot of times when you have books with people of color and they talk about society and they talk about racism, a lot of times it's one dimensional. It's just straight on. It's the way I'm being treated and how I react to it. I sort of enjoy telling the stories of folks, what it does to you as the individual, because I think it humanizes the individual to go through, hopefully to create empathy more so than sympathy. I think empathy is more powerful over time. If you can get the reader to feel for and see themselves in a character, I think it's more powerful. And that's sort of what I wanted. The goal for Jupiter was you feel his rage, but you also feel hopefully his confusion, that he wants to be at peace. He wants to be free. He wants to be free within, because there's the idea of freedom of, okay, you don't have to be enslaved anymore physically, and you don't have to do all of these things on the plantation. But what about within yourself? What do you do with all of this hurt that you've been carrying for generations? And, at first he lets it out in a very visceral way, but that comes around at a certain point, because at the end of the day, he still wants to be a human being and have human connections and human relationships.
And there's two things you kind of said there that stood out to me. One is the way that others view and perceive somebody too, which I think really connects. We're doing Deathlock, and I just finished rereading that. We're doing Cyberfolk. And that's what's going on with Michael Collins. Specifically, and McDuffie's, of course, is playing on double consciousness and Du Bois. I mean, he's quoting him verbatim.
Right.
But what I realized as I reread that too is Mecha Doom's the same thing. He's struggling to find his own identity in the latter part of that arc. But the other thing that you kind of pointed out there too, I think that's important that I've kind of thought about too reading this, is the idea of freedom. Because you have Tevin mention it to John Adams after, I think, whoever's killed in the hideout or whatever. And he's basically like, I deliver this to you. I'm free now, basically. Right. And then there's a later kind of sequence where I think maybe after he talks to his grandmother, he has the bird, which reminds me, of course, of Paul Laurence Dunbar's Sympathy, and I Know Why the Cageburg Sings, and this idea and image of freedom. So how do you kind of see freedom or being free working here? You kind of touched on it a little bit, I think, with being free.
I think, at its best, freedom is the ability to self-actualize within a society. And I don't think the characters of Killadelphia, to lesser or greater degrees, live in a world where they feel as though they can self-actualize, where they can be the best versions of themselves. John Adams picked certain types of people for certain reasons, their flaws, their anger, their hurt, their pain, and promised them that he would give them immortality and perspective, which is what vampirism is, because you become a predator. You have the ability to see human beings and all of their frailties, because the idea, in a very common sense, is to get their blood. I wanted to take that idea and sort of evolve it a little bit to where, okay, yeah, I still want blood and I need that to survive on a physical level, but how do I survive on an emotional level? What do I do to get past? Because I wanted to use humanity as something that haunted the vampire himself. Like, I have this power, but I'm still burdened by who I was as a human being. I can't shake that part. And even though now I have eternity, I mean, the whole thing came when the idea for that came about. I had a troubled relationship with my father coming up, and he passed away, and not too long ago. And I remember thinking that, or wondering, if we had more time, would we have been able to sort of narrow the gap between our differences. And so, vampires are immortal. They have all the time in the world. But there still has to be that level of commitment to actually fixing the problem. Time isn't the issue as much as it is the desire to do a thing. What's standing in the way of that? Our belief systems and how we see ourselves. And I wanted to get to that on a core root level to say, okay, if we're talking about freedom, the ability to see myself objectively, clearly, and have a level of self-awareness, I have to live in a society, or not necessarily in a society, but in a community that is free of certain ideas. I can find negative imagery from childhood, from I think the school system at times, the American school system teaches us that we're second class, people of color, that you're second class citizens, even if it's not spoken out loud. When you look at who contributed to what, it's typically not people of color, even though a lot of us know, if we do independent study, that there were contributions, massive contributions, but that's not part of the curriculum that we're taught as children. So subconsciously, you're already sort of being inundated with this idea that you are less. That continues to grow and grow and grow and grow and fester within. That will result in a certain type of behavior, I believe, or at least some sense of how you see yourself. And so when you speak to freedom, it's difficult to be free and to be the best version of yourself if you're already entering the game behind the 8 ball.
Right.
And how you see yourself, because that level of confidence that you need, that level of just an open mind to be able to see the world as it is, not necessarily how it feels, is it's difficult. It's really, really difficult. So you find ideologies and philosophies that sort of speak to your fears more so than the things that are actually going to empower you. So again, I think to lesser, greater degrees, all of the characters are sort of burdened by that idea, but more on a personal level. The things with Seesaw, seeing what happened to his grandmother and how she lived and how she had her heart broken. His mother fell into despair with substance abuse issues because of some other issues. I think it's in, I don't want to give away arc number 4, but there are a lot, each character has a story. And if you find that arc, if you look at the personal aspect of that character, you understand the vampire version, because physically they have all the power they need. They're only burdened by the ideas that limit them in their minds.
Yeah, and I think that's something I haven't thought about, but something definitely after you said that I noticed. All dealing with that humanity. Because I think about Brittany's sister, one who wants to turn back, and then later in arc 3 or book 3, she's wants to go back to being a vampire, right? That's what Jefferson and Adams are dealing with. That's what the Sangsters are dealing with. I mean, that's what all of them are dealing with. And that kind of leads me to the question about Estelle, about, Seesaw's grandmother, because I think that her passing and what Seesaw says at the end, I think is really kind of powerful. And it kind of speaks, I think, to what you were saying a second ago too, about what we're taught. And going back to your discussion of the history that we learn, which is all encompassing, I think, in this discussion. But when he comes in and he holds her hand, she's already been covered up with the cloth, right? And he holds her hand and he tells her, "The world did you wrong, Grandma, but best believe they're going to feel that shit. Each and every one of the motherfuckers is going to know your name." And then the next page shows him, of course, with standing at the window looking out on Philadelphia. And he says, "They're going to know your name." So kind of within his pronouncement, I think, is that comment of what you're talking about and whose stories we remember, who we deem worthy of collective memory. And this is what Adams talks about too, after seeing Hamilton. I still haven't seen Hamilton.
I won't give it away. No spoilers.
Well, I did, FYI, I did listen to a podcast about Aaron Burr, and I really like Aaron Burr. Okay. He was very, from what I understand, I started reading a book, very progressive, regards to race, regards to gender, everything else. Anyways, whole nother discussion, because there was the panel with I think Jefferson calling somebody Burr or something like that, or Adams. But anyways, can you speak some to the role that memory and the telling of stories, because it's not just, I think, history, but it's also communal telling of stories?
No, that's a great question. A lot of where that came from was, when you look at the news, the nightly news, and you hear about, violence in the inner city and people that have lost their lives. You hear about it almost like, 8 people died tonight or 3 people died tonight. And it sort of dulls the idea that those people meant something to somebody and that they were real human beings. And so, Seesaw's grandmother dying won't make the news. It's just a blip. It's something, she came, she left, they'll take her body, she'll be buried or whatever, but it won't matter, to the world. But it matters to him. Mm-hmm. And everybody matters to somebody. And I wanted that idea. This is another one of those ideas when you talk about, freedom and the motivations of the vampires in this book. A lot of it is they felt invisible, in their lives when they were human beings. They were just, some were homeless, some were poor, some were scraping to get by, some were not, no one was thriving emotionally. Let's put it that way, to whatever level of class distinction that they were in, middle class, lower class, whatever. And even back in the past, I think when we get into Abigail's feelings of being subjugated and, different characters feeling as though they didn't live up to their potential, it was the idea of this society that sort of limited them. And again, there are pros to this idea as well. This isn't all about like bashing America or anything like that, but it's more or less looking at the world in the construct of what we're living in today. And I wanted Seesaw's motivations to be more, I wanted all of the vampires' motivations to be more than just blood. And for him, he's sort of the voice, that character, Seesaw in general, that character is sort of the voice of the street. He's the voice of the voiceless. He's the guy that would work at Kinko's and go home and hope that one day he would have a better life than the day that he had before. And with an idea, with a nod in the back of his mind that it probably is going to be the same thing the day after, the day after, the day after, and not trying to deal with that depression or anxiety that comes with that. If you're cool with that life, fantastic. But I don't think he ever was. He wanted to be the best version of himself. So when Adams presents him with the idea of world domination and all of that, he's like, I just want to be free, man. I just want to go and be at peace. Why can't everybody just do them? Why does it have to be this idea of, join another type of rat race, of trying to overtake and overthrow and do another system? What system has ever worked for me and the people that I know and the people that I love? And I think that's connected to Grandma. I think that's connected to a bigger idea. And I always try to put in Seesaw bigger ideas.
So I definitely see that. I mean, with the introduction, he goes to visit Jesus in the 3rd volume. And
yes.
He visits Anansi, which I think is, like I said, they're not reading volume 3, but we're doing Greg Anderson Elisa's books. Is Nana, and they're going to be introduced to Anansi. So I think that's important. I really kind of like that thread, but it leads me kind of another discussion too. One thing you mentioned too is the fact that Seesaw kind of says that, or I would say others say that no system really works. Why can't we just do,
right,
and live?
Yeah.
And that's kind of the question, because one of the things that John Adams comes back to do is to fix democracy, essentially.
Right.
So how do you kind of see the differences between John Adams and Abigail's kind of positions? Because John seems to kind of, he recognizes the systems are wrong. Even Jefferson recognizes they're wrong, it seems like too. Do you think they'll ever get to fixing it? Or hold up, not within Killadelphia.
Right.
I guess the question is, do you think we'll ever get around to being true democracy? Maybe that's the question.
No, I don't. I don't think that's, I think that's sort of, no. I don't think it's possible. I think there are too many voices of power that sort of play a role in how we make our decisions. There are folks who say the NRA has a lot, the lobbyists that prevent the type of gun control that many want. All of this stuff really comes down to more of an oligarchy that I think it makes it really, really difficult to have that idealistic idea of what democracy can be, one man, one vote, one country, where we're all sort of what I was taught, a melting pot, of all different cultures, and everybody's going to be at peace, and, you get what you work for, and, all of those things. There's so many other things. There's no redlining in that idea. There's no all of these other things that come along with voter suppression, and as long as those things exist, it's really, really difficult, I think, to have a pure democracy, because you're always tinkering with trying to tilt the scales in your favor.
Well, that kind of leads me to this next question too, because I agree with you. I've kind of come to the point where I'm like, we're never going to achieve a true democracy, no matter how hard we try.
I mean, if the system evolves, if there's like a revolution and the system evolves to some other form of something, but I don't know what that would look like either.
I don't either, but that leads me to kind of this question, because one of the things that Abigail plays on, and that others in the series play on too, is fear. And the use of fear to control. And when you're talking about individuals who are in power, wealthy individuals, they use fear to divide and control. So the use of fear as a weapon of control is a theme that runs throughout Killadelphia. I want to give you part of a speech, one of my favorite quotes from Lillian Smith. She delivered this to SNCC members on the eve of the Atlanta sit-ins. So the Atlanta sit-ins were October 19th, 1960. She delivered the keynote speech at a SNCC meeting on October 16th in Atlanta. And this is what she told the audience. The devil knows that if you want to destroy a man, all you need to do is fill him with false hopes and false fears. These will blind him to his true direction, and he will inevitably turn away from the future and destroy those close to him. It is as true of a nation. Fill its people with false hopes and false fears, and they will do the rest. They will go straight to their appointment with death, and they will drag all nations friendly to them down into the maelstrom of their moral and mental confusion. So can you talk some about the role that fear plays? I'm thinking about Jupiter.
Oh, yeah.
But with John and Abigail or others.
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't remember which issue, because we're moving into the 20s. I'm almost in the 30s now, but I remember we went to the suburbs. The vampires went to the suburbs and started sort of cleaning it out when they were taking over. They were breaking down Philadelphia.
Oh, was that the one where Brittany
had the girl in her mouth? Yes.
Yeah.
The kid in her mouth.
I'll find that page real quick. That's
a
page.
Yeah, that's Jason's Crown and Glory there. That was a great page, a great image. Did it exactly well. It was the cat first. At first it was the kitten, and then when the parents came downstairs, it was the kid. That was speaking directly to white flight, when white folks were leaving the inner cities and moving out to the suburbs, and and that whole thing was fear-based, seemingly, if my studies are true. A lot of that was about really, getting away from the crime and what they believed that Black people would bring.
Well, that's what's going on with a lot of these moves to kind of secede from towns too, right?
Yes, all of that as well. And electoral votes, and how we're going to shift and change and sort of make certain areas mean more than other areas. And so, it was really clearly speaking to that idea that to give something visceral to that fear. Like, it's not just, this is what happens when you don't tend to certain areas of your city, your country, your area, that fear that you feel, can be realized. It's not just about trying to hide and, get a gun and try to, create a fortress for yourself. That these things don't just stay in the inner city, that they bleed out into society at large. And I think we see it now. You see, here in LA, a lot of crime, and a lot of crime that's now moving into Beverly Hills and moving into some of the areas that before, weren't touched in the same kind of way. And I think a lot of that has to do with just generationally, folks being ignored, just problems on top of problems. And so, yeah, I think fear fear is an incredible motivator. I think when we look at the news and how now we have such a polarized idea of what the news is, that in order to make you hate the other side, you make fear, like you weaponize that idea of fear of what's going to happen to you, sort of like, Willie Horton with the Reagan thing. Like,
I was about to say, can you say what that is for my students, please?
Yeah, when Ronald Reagan was running for president, I believe it was Reagan.
It was Bush.
It was Bush. Okay, it was Bush. There you go. When
First
Bush was running for president, this is why I'm not a professor. When Bush was running for president, there was this guy named Willie Horton. I don't know if he was supposedly had killed somebody or something that he had done, or he had gotten out of prison, and they were blaming the liberals and liberal policies for why the Willie Hortons, that if you don't control this, your Willie Horton is coming to your community and coming to your area. Sort of like what I believe when they were talking about the border and last year, and that if you don't stop and create this wall at the border, that these people are going to come in and, kill all of us, and it's going to be so bad. And so that idea of fear, to create this image in your mind that if you don't do what I want you to do, that this is what's going to happen to our pristine world.
Well, fear comes back into the fact, if you want to go back to the definition from Martin, that the Gothic is the conservative impulse to protect, the politically conservative, right? And you're talking about this page. This is the page you were talking about with Brittany, right? That's the
yes, that's the fear.
And the politically conservative in this way too, the discussions of the border, the discussions of of moving the urban moving out to the suburbs and all this stuff too, plays into that fear. And it also plays into the fear of what I'm going to lose personally instead of helping somebody else out. Right.
Yes. And Nightmare on Elm Street did a good job with that too. The idea of Freddy Krueger and, the families in the community sort of banding together. They're going to protect their neighborhood by, killing this guy. But the whole idea of white flight, I think all of those movies that I love from the 80s were about that.
I have to say, I'm not a horror fan when it comes to movies, so I've never seen.
Really, you never seen Nightmare on Elm Street, man? You got to see Nightmare on Elm Street.
So you know what's crazy is my son. He's never watched them, but he's like collecting all the Jason Voorhees and Michael Myers figures and all this stuff. He's like so into horror, but I'm fine with reading this.
Yeah.
I just don't. Horror's never really been like my thing. Maybe I'll get into it soon. Maybe that's what's going to happen.
I can, just as an advocate, I can say that. Not so much today's horror, nothing against it. Today's horror feels like pure entertainment juxtaposed to those movies like Dawn of the Dead, which was about capitalism, the dangers of capitalism, and Night of the Living Dead, which dealt with race and Vietnam War. And a lot of those movies, just taught me so much perspective, just sort of broadened my horizons as to how I saw the world. I think filmmakers have been using genre to talk about problems in the world, from nuclear war, fears about nuclear war in general, immigration, just different things that they sort of package it in this monster, and what the metaphor of what this monster means. That's certainly what I'm doing with Killadelphia. I'm inspired by all of that stuff and things that I grew up with, what Dracula was, and the Wolfman, and the fear of gypsies and all of that type of stuff. I'm influenced by all of that stuff. So,
well, I think that's one of the reasons I'm wanting to do this course too, because one of the things they're going to read is Toni Morrison's Playing in the Dark, which is a collection of essays or speeches she gave, I think at Harvard, if I remember correctly. But basically she says that, and talks about the Africanist presence, her phrasing there within American literature. And the fact, authors like Hemingway, there's his short story, The Big Two-Hearted River. There are these crickets who were charred, and it's dealing with actually, African Americans who were pushed out, basically. Edgar Allan Poe, the two stories we're going to do, we're actually dealing with Hot Frog, which is one of the stories we're doing, actually is kind of a commentary on slave revolts and the fear of slave revolts, even though there's no Black characters in it, right? So these whole kind of genres, they discuss these things, and pop culture does it too, whether we realize it or not.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So I think that that's important. And one thing I kind of want to show them with this as well. So I'm trying to find this other page real quick too, because in the opening of issue 9, so this is going back to Jupiter, we see him sitting in a cell. I think it's actually Abigail's hideout. I never got it.
Yeah.
He got shackles around his wrist and ankles and a spit guard on his mouth. And it's probably one of my favorite 5-panel sequences. When I find it, I'll pull it up. And Alexander's illustrations vividly show Jupiter's psychological state. We've talked about this a little bit, but his quote, actually, I'm going to go back to the quotes, because he quotes, I had to look it up. He quotes Thelonious Monk, which I didn't realize that was who was quoting, right? What's that quote? A man is a genius only to himself.
Mm-hmm.
And then after that, we see a panel where he's sitting in the chair, head down, and he asks, what if one isn't aware of who one is? So it kind of gets back to that discussion of identity. And I guess, can we kind of talk about that with some other characters? Because Toppy's backstory really interests me. And I don't know what to think of it.
Yeah. I wanted the idea. I learned through independent study that there were Black soldiers on the other side as well, not just necessarily on the Union side. And I was like, what must that have worked like? You know, a lot of times when I'm writing these characters, I try to go against the grain of what things are supposed to be. And yeah, there's my man Jupiter.
The reason I like this page too is because the border or the gutter separates his legs right here.
Mm-hmm.
So you're getting the full image with these. And then I want to go back to Toppy too, but one other thing too is I think this piece from Alexander.
Mm-hmm.
You have him younger, you have the rage older, but you also have the spit guard too on his mouth.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That kind of juxtaposition.
And the vampire down in the corner on the other side. Yeah. But the vampire was connected to the rage and all of that. Yeah. Well, with Toppy, it was more of he wasn't as emotionally connected because he had lived a different type of existence in regards to slavery. He found a lane and sort of went with that lane. So it was more about survival. He was able to survive in a way that wasn't quite as, from his perspective, dehumanizing. You know, so he had no connection to African American culture in the same way that, you know, like I'm a slave and I'm treated poorly and I want to be free and all of those things. It's like he already in his mind felt as though he was free, but then that caught up with him and he learned the truth of the world that he was really in, that there was more to it than, yeah, he goes to Deadwood and becomes a mortician, I believe. And, you know, things are going along pretty good. Vincent Price makes an appearance in there somewhere. I don't remember. We used to stick people in there. We still will at some point. But, you know, he thought he had gotten past all of that, that it would never come back to haunt him, but it did. And we're still paying the price for Toppy's hurt in today's world.
There's just so much to pull out, I would say, from this whole series. Now that I started rereading it,
thank you.
It's just, I don't know where to go. But this page too, of course, with Jupiter, where he's going back in the street, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but this is their Boston Tea Party. What does he say? Let me see. I thought he said something else. But this reminds me too of probably what you were talking about earlier, kind of the white flight a little bit.
Yeah. It's funny how I forget these words after a while.
This right here, sorry. This is what I was thinking about. I wish the great Thomas Jefferson was here to witness this uprising. He'd no doubt rationalize the violence as savages behaving savagely.
Mm-hmm.
And I was trying to look up the quote from Jefferson. I couldn't find it. He was writing to somebody in 1820 or 18, I think it was 1820, but about the role. And I know all of this stuff about slavery, saying that it's a stain on, it's going to come back and bite us and all that, but still dehumanizing African Americans. But he wrote to somebody and said, the purpose of the women is to actually make babies for money.
Mm-hmm.
That's essentially what he said. And he's like, the men don't make this as much as women do. They just, you use them and they're gone. Right. So I think that very poignant that when Jupiter tries to come and kill Jefferson or Turnham. Mm-hmm. It's not Jupiter that does it, but it's
yes. Yeah.
I was letting you finish it up, but it is
the Eterna. But yes, right. Yes. I try not to give parts away because I live in this weird space of I know what's coming because I'm writing it, but I don't remember exactly what I've already done. I don't remember because we're in this weird place with Arc 4 Arc 5 now because 4 is done. I'm actually writing Arc 5, but all of the issues haven't come out yet. But there's this group, the Eterna, that are the original, for lack of a better word, people on the earth, and they have come back to reclaim the earth in a different way, and they turned Thomas Jefferson, not so much Jupiter, who wanted revenge. That's them.
But it reminds me too of his treatment of Sally Hemings, right?
Yes.
The fact that it's the women who do it.
Yes.
And that leads us to something else too that I think is, kind of powerful, is Abigail's relationship with Hemings.
Mm-hmm.
Because she starts the relationship and she does it, and they seem to love each other, but then of course she goes back and falls back with John. So yes. Actually, kind of two questions here.
Mm-hmm.
You kind of talk about that relationship between Abigail and Sally, but also the role of Brittany here, because I don't think we haven't gotten much of her backstory yet, at least from what I've read.
In issue 5, I think was the one that had the majority, I think, of her backstory.
With her sister, right?
Her and her sister, when they came to Abigail after, I think it was after slavery, and their parents had been killed. Mm-hmm. And there was just 2 little girls walking on a road, not knowing what was coming next. And they come upon Abigail, and Abigail takes them in and turns them as kids. And they're kids for the rest of eternity. But within that, they just wanted to be safe. They just wanted nurturing. They just wanted to be protected. They didn't know what they were signing up for. And one embraced it, Brittany, and the other one didn't, Brianna. So yeah, my actual 2 daughters as well.
And our introduction to Brittany, I think, is really important too. The sexual violence. I mean, it runs through the sexual violence against Black women, and specifically the Black girl.
All of that. And so it was just an idea. I think Jason's art is incredible throughout, but I love these panels a lot because they're haunting.
Well, this reminds me a little bit of Kara Walker stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I just noticed that with the silhouettes.
Yeah. He never makes it the same. It never looks. It's always something different. But yeah. But no, Sally coming into the story was really about again, another person. I remember reading, an article or something about, the love story that was Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson. It's like, well, how can you have a love story when one side of the equation is enslaved and doesn't really have a lot of say in the relationship? And it's really similar with Sally Hemings and with Abigail Adams, in the sense that when both of them get power and what they do with it, Sally's going to do something really big coming up. But neither of them, when Abigail comes back to John, it's more about the pact that they built as a power couple of sorts. It's not necessarily out of love. It's out of, I know what I can accomplish with this guy. And that's why the emotional part of her is able to bond with Abigail. So, yeah.
The thing with Sally too that I think is important, and this is something I try and tell students too. One thing I think that I learned is, of course, when Jefferson's wife died, he of course raped Sally, and it's partly because she looked like his wife, from what I understand, right? Because they were related.
Yeah.
But the other thing with that story too is the fact that this was knowledge at the time among African-American authors and others, that this is not new knowledge. When you go back to that discussion of history, right? I mean, the first African-American novel by an African-American male is Clotel, or The President's Daughter, which deals with kind of fictionally Thomas Jefferson's daughter, and she kills herself by jumping off a bridge inside of the Capitol in DC, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this is knowledge that is around at the time, and that the knowledge, of course, when the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, or whatever, was trying to purchase Mount Vernon and turn it into, what it is. There was William Wilson. He went by the name Ethiop, wrote a piece called the African American Picture Gallery, which it was basically set up kind of like a museum, walking around the pictures. And one of the pictures is Mount Vernon and the ghost of the enslaved who were buried there. This is 1850, right? So all this knowledge is there.
Yes.
And yet we think that this is new, somehow kind of history we're learning.
Yeah. And well, again, the motivation, what's under Killadelphia, and why I always go back to history, is because I never got that history. And I've had so many people come up to me at conventions and ask me, what's true, what's not true. I started looking at history again because of this book, or, you sort of make history interesting, in some ways. And that's the whole idea. And a lot of times when you see miniseries on John Adams or a lot of historical figures, you never ever see people of color prominently positioned within the narrative. Very rarely. I'm sure that, there have been some that I've missed.
Trying to prepare for this, I watched the first episode of John Adams, and I was happy that they didn't mention his name, but they had Crispus Attucks as one of the victims.
Okay, well then there you go.
But he didn't have a role though. He just they showed his dead body.
Right. And so my thing was, we have walked through history together, all of us, on an equal playing field. Every group, Black people, white people, everybody we've all experienced this history together. It's not fair that only one side of the story gets to be told and sort of canonized in a way that serves as propaganda a lot of times. So if I can add this little footnote into, graphic novel history of creating a thing where we get some tidbits and anecdotes about history that are a little bit more closer to what I believe accuracy to be. We never know because it's history and it's what people reported to us. I think that's a worthy endeavor.
So Thomas Jefferson never played Woodstock?
Well, I always thought I wanted Thomas to be
his outfit looks 1960s rocker.
Well, yes, that was it. That was the whole idea of Jim Morrison. I want him to be like,
he does look like that when I first see him in the confessional booth.
Yes, I wanted him to be that guy. Each guy is different, now that we have George Washington in it as well. I want each guy to have his own personality, away from the wig and the blouse. How can you make it different in some way?
So let me kind of wrap up on this. I don't really know how the question's going to go here, but another thing, you talk about history, but another thing that I think is really kind of good with this book is I want to say amalgamation, but the bringing together of different mythologies and religious ideas. I mean, because you have Charon with James Sangster, right? Carry him over the river. Yep. You have these ideas of heaven and of hell. You have, I think it's Satan. I can't say for sure, but
Corson, one of the 4 demons, the major demons of hell.
So, and then of course you have Anansi, then you have Jesus. So can you talk about and this adds to the supernatural kind of Gothic element, but can you kind of talk about that too? Because religion and myths and storytelling, gets all back to that, play a huge role in how we think about ourselves and kind of think about our identity, right?
Yeah, I mean, for initially, when Jesus and Seesaw have that conversation, what I was speaking to was how there's an aspect of Christianity that the African American culture was given at the lowest point in its history by people who didn't necessarily have their best interests at heart. So it's hard to believe that that would be the purest form, or the form that would empower, or take them to another place's people. If anything, it was, I think, used as sort of a calming mechanism to keep you working and to look that one day there's going to be some hope. That once you die, you're going to get to the milk and honey and just keep working and don't really think about anything else except for the milk and the honey. And I think Seesaw is looking to talk to Jesus about why would you allow that to exist in people who follow you? And his grandmother believed in that. That's why she turned down the opportunity to be a vampire, because she believed she was going to something that was better. And in a weird way, she sort of did go to something that was better when he hooked up with her, which, again, I'm not judging. I'm not saying Christianity's bad or wrong or anything like that. Just offering a different argument, various, arguments about the same thing. And so, he questions Jesus about that. And I didn't want to limit it to just Christianity. You have so many great, folklore gods and deities throughout history of different cultures, and Zarathustra, and Anansi and Bilquis, and so many of them that it was like, why not? Why not bring all of them into on an equal playing field, along with Jesus and along with Buddha and along with Muhammad and all of them, and speak to all of it, not just one aspect of Norse mythology or Greek mythology. Let's look at all of it on an equal playing field, and that's sort of what Killadelphia is too, making everybody equal.
Yeah, I can totally see that, and like I said, it brings back that idea of our search for ourselves and who we are, but also it connects with that discussion of history. We are connection with humanity. So thank you for taking the time to join me today.
Oh, I enjoyed it. Thank you very much. Thank you for going so in depth in Killadelphia and just doing this in general. We really appreciate it. And I'm adding Jason into the we. We really do appreciate it. And I hope your students enjoy it. And thank you.
Thank you.